This is a presentation of a paper published in Computer Graphics Forum. It is a joint work of Natalia and Gennady Andrienko, Siming Chen, and Brian Fisher. We conducted an empirical study to observe how participants use visual representations of complex phenomena to generate knowledge. I shall begin with arguing why visual analytics requires a different kind of empirical studies than information visualization. Next, I shall describe our approach to data acquisition and the conduct of our experiments. Then I shall introduce the methods we used to analyze the empirical data collected. I shall briefly present the main findings from our analysis and discuss how well the knowledge-building processes we observed are described by the existing theoretical models. First, I want to argue why visual analytics and information visualization require different types of empirical studies. The information visualization pipeline is in fact a part of the visual analytics process. It focuses on accurately representing information for easy perception by the user. Visual analytics focuses on using visual displays for analytical reasoning and knowledge building. Empirical studies in information visualization investigate how clearly and accurately users can perceive information in visual display. Empirical studies in visual analytics need to investigate how analysts used perceived information to construct knowledge. The fundamental difference in research questions requires different approaches to empirical studies. In information visualization, researchers can compare encoded information with information perceived by users to measure accuracy, which can be compared between different representations. In visual analytics, knowledge is not directly encoded in a display, but needs to be inferred from available information. It is unclear what should be the reference for comparing knowledge constructed by analysts. Even if we can somehow measure the quality of the knowledge gained, we would still have quite little understanding of how this general knowledge has been derived from specific pieces of information. Therefore, visual analytics requires empirical studies that can give us a better understanding of how analysts proceed from information to knowledge. With this motivation, we have done our empirical studies. The main principle was unobtrusive observation of the analytical reasoning process. In our experiments, we did not intend to assess participants' performance, and we also did not want to impose or suggest any particular way to do the analysis. To see how participants construct knowledge from visually encoded data, we needed to engage them in realistic analysis scenarios with sufficiently challenging tasks and non-obvious patterns that require contemplation. We gave our participants complex map-based visualizations showing geographic distributions of two or more phenomena. There were three analysis scenarios with maps representing different territories and phenomena. The general analysis task was to characterize relationships between the phenomena. The participants analyzed all three maps in the order of increasing difficulty. We succeeded to recruit 8 participants, despite the traveling and meeting restrictions during the COVID-19 pandemic. The participants varied in professional background, age, and work experience. We expected them to apply diverse approaches to fulfilling the tasks. In each session, one researcher worked with one participant in a separate room. After introducing the data and goal of analysis, the researcher showed the map and explained the visual encoding. The same information was also available on the computer screen. When participants felt ready, they received the task page for doing the analysis. During the analysis, the participants were asked to think aloud, and their utterances were recorded along with gaze tracking. The participants were also asked to mark visual patterns that appeared important, interesting, or surprising to them. The patterns were marked by dragging labels from 1 to 5 onto the map. This is an example of a map with 4 labels placed on it by one of the participants. In the result, we collected empirical data of several types: tracks of gaze positions, recorded sessions with oral statements accompanied by eye movements, and placements of pattern markers. In our experiments, we intentionally had no ground truth for assessing the correctness of the answers. We had no assumptions concerning the right or optimal approach to the analysis. We did not instruct the participants what kinds of patterns to look for. Moreover, we did not give them any definition of a pattern, relying on their intuitive understanding of this notion. We expected and wanted the participants to take individual ways to do the analysis, find their individual areas of interest, and apply their individual judgments of importance or interestingness. Therefore, there would be no worth in comparing the areas of interest and sequences of gaze fixations of different participants. Instead, we wanted to identify generic analytical operations applied by multiple participants. This could be achieved by finding repeated patterns of eye movements across the participants and scenarios, regardless of specific areas of interest and the sequences in which they were attended. To fulfill this goal, we needed methods enabling high level of abstraction. One method to analyze the eye tracks was scarf plots. The gaze positions in the map are encoded by colors using a continuous two-dimensional color scale. The tracks are represented by bars stretching along the time axis. Bar segments are colored according to the gaze positions at the corresponding time moments. The scarf plots allow us to abstract from specific positions in the images and consider only the character of color variation along time. We can notice and interpret different patterns of color variation irrespective of the corresponding gaze positions. Moreover, we can even disregard the colors as such. Regardless of specific colors, we can see long segments of low color variation, intrusions of contrasting colors, highly colorful segments, reoccurrences of same colors, alternation of two color tones, and other patterns of coloring. Such patterns can be interpreted as different kinds of perceptual activities. Another abstraction of the data is provided by a gaze flow map. We identify individual areas of interest by enclosing clusters of fixation points. Then we summarize eye moves between the areas into flows of different magnitude. This view enables abstraction from time and sequence of attention fixation. Like with the scarf plots, we consider flow maps across all participants and scenarios, seeking for general patterns. The flow maps demonstrate two different strategies of exploring a visual display. We call them selective focusing and comprehensive coverage. Selective focusing means that participants' attention is mainly given to several regions. In comprehensive coverage, participants' attention is distributed more evenly over the display space. To achieve even a higher level of abstraction, we transform the flow maps to graphs. The vertices represent the individual areas of interest, labeled by ordinal numbers in the order of decreasing frequencies of gaze fixations. A common standard layout applied to graphs supports comparisons across participants and scenarios, regardless of the differences between the displays and the positions of the areas of interest. Graph edges summarize long-distance eye moves. This allows us to ignore continuous scanning and comparisons between neighboring areas of interest. Instead, we can reveal existence of memorized reference areas to which the attention repeatedly returns. Besides, strong flows between distant areas may signify that participants have detected similar local patterns, which may provide the base for generalizing. Here are examples of several structural patterns in transition graphs and possible interpretations of such patterns. We see pairwise and one-to-many comparisons, apparent attempts of joint considerations of several areas, as well as absence of important areas, which may signify difficulty to find relevant patterns. Eye movements can inform us only about low-level cognitive activities of analysis, such as distribution of attention. However, they do not tell us why participants looked at particular areas, what they see there, and what they think about it. To have information about participants' observations and reasoning, we ask them to think aloud and recorded what they say in parallel with eye tracking. To associate gaze patterns with higher-level cognitive activities, we replayed the recorded analysis sessions, viewing animated gaze motions and simultaneously listening to participants' speeches. We described our observations in a document. We noted the character of gaze fixations and movements, what the participants looked at, and what they said. On this basis, we identified their cognitive operations as searching, assessing, comparing, checking, explaining, and so on. Later, we inserted in the documents fragments of scarf plots corresponding to these activities. When we investigated the voice records and concurrent eye movements, we noticed that participants verbalized only a small part of their analytical activities. We saw evidences of doing much more assessments and comparisons than it was announced. This means that the Think Aloud protocol alone provides insufficient information for empirical studies of visual analytics activities. However, eye tracking alone is also not sufficient, because the meanings of eye movements cannot be understood without verbal commands. Verbal statements permit interpretation of the preceding and the following eye movements. The interpretation can be extrapolated to similar eye movements that are not accompanied by explicit statements. The general guidelines for conducting studies with eye tracking warn that concurrent verbalization may affect the patterns of eye movement. Our participants did not talk continuously, but usually said something before and or after performing a task of visual exploration. Depending on what they said, we can adjust the interpretation of the eye movement patterns by associating the statements with preceding or following eye movements. However, eye movement patterns alone signify only low-level cognitive activities and do not reflect participants' reasoning. Therefore, Think Aloud protocol is very important for empirical studies in visual analytics. The results of our analysis are described and discussed in detail in the paper. Here we briefly mention the key points. We noticed two strategies of visual exploration: selective focusing and comprehensive coverage. Observed visual patterns are formed by relationships between visual marks, such as cross-layer collocation, similarity difference, spatial neighborhood, separation, and alignment. Participants can notice visual patterns of different spatial scales: local, regional, distributed, or global. Participants describe their observations in terms of data patterns rather than visual patterns. For example, they may say high traffic density and large number of events rather than dark spot and large circle. We saw that participants strive to explain what they observe, although we did not ask for that. There were two strategies for analysis, hypothesis-driven and compilatory, which means gathering of relevant information pieces. When participants made hypotheses, they usually strove to find counter-evidence. The attempts to explain findings suggest that participants constructed new knowledge, linking verified findings to background knowledge. The participants repeatedly assessed their current mental models regarding not only faithfulness to the data, but also explainability and credibility. In a few cases, participants stopped their analysis when they could neither make definite conclusions nor further improve their knowledge. There are several theoretical models of the visual analysis process that can partly describe our observations. Different models emphasize the key role of top-down cognitive processes, repeated generation and verification of hypotheses, iterative evaluation of and further development of the mental model, transformation of data insights to domain insights by linking to analysis context, which includes conceptual model of the domain, and formation of data patterns by abstraction of multiple data items linked by relationships. We found that none of the theories taken alone is sufficient for describing the analysis processes that took place in our experiments. The theories appear to be complementary and need to be used in combination. In conclusion, it is important to note that visual analytics strongly needs empirical studies of the processes of analytical reasoning and knowledge building. This requires non-trivial data and analysis tasks. Empirical data can be collected by combining think-aloud protocol with eye tracking. The studies will allow to evaluate and elaborate the theoretical models of the analysis process. This concludes my talk. Here are references to the papers presenting the theoretical models and to our paper. I will be glad to answer questions and to discuss our experiences and ideas offline with anyone interested.